If you grew up in the 1990s, there's a strange psychological trait you probably have and never noticed. You can sit in silence and not reach for your phone. You can get bored and actually be okay with it. To anyone under 30, that sounds impossible. But to you, it's just normal. Because you grew up in the last decade on Earth where boredom wasn't instantly cured. And that one difference may have shaped your brain more than you think. Here's what actually happened. The 1990s generation grew up in a very unusual moment in history. For thousands of years, life changed relatively slowly. But people growing up in the 90s witnessed one of the fastest transformations humanity has ever experienced. Many of them started childhood in an analog world. They watched cartoons on television schedules. If they missed an episode, they missed it. There was no streaming, no YouTube, no endless library of content available at any moment. Then suddenly the internet arrived. Computers entered homes. Mobile phones became common. And before they even reached adulthood, the entire world had changed. Psychologists call this a formative environment. The conditions we experience during childhood often shape our beliefs and habits for life. People who grew up in the 90s learned something unusual. They learned how to adapt, because the world around them never stopped changing. They had to become psychological bridge builders between two completely different eras. And that boredom you're okay with today, that came from somewhere specific. When 90s kids got bored, they had no phone to reach for. They had to invent something. They built forts. They rode bicycles. They created imaginary worlds. Or they simply sat and daydreamed. And psychologists have discovered something fascinating about this. Periods of boredom often encourage creativity. When the brain isn't constantly entertained, it starts generating ideas on its own. This means many people who grew up in the 90s spent years exercising a mental skill that is becoming increasingly rare today. The ability to create entertainment instead of consuming it. Now here's something you probably haven't thought about in years. Remember knocking on a friend's door instead of sending a text? You literally walked to someone's house and hoped they were home. No tracking, no messages, just hope. That created a completely different kind of social experience. People learned to read facial expressions, body language, and social cues through constant in-person interaction. And that shaped a psychological appreciation for physical presence that still influences them today. This can create a strange feeling now. Many people who grew up in the 90s enjoy technology, but occasionally feel overwhelmed by how connected the modern world has become. They remember what it felt like to disappear for an afternoon, and sometimes they miss it. But here's the part almost nobody talks about. People growing up in the 1990s were repeatedly told the future would be amazing. Technology would improve life. The internet would connect humanity. Then adulthood arrived. And reality turned out to be more complicated. Economic crises, political division, information overload. This created a strange psychological mix, optimism and skepticism existing side by side. Many people from this generation still believe progress is possible, but they've also learned that every new invention brings both opportunities and problems. Psychologists sometimes call this adaptive realism, the ability to remain hopeful without becoming naive. Now, here's something even more surprising. Many people who grew up in the 90s share a strong emotional connection to nostalgia. But nostalgia isn't just remembering the past. Studies suggest nostalgia can improve mood, increase feelings of meaning, and even reduce loneliness. That's why hearing an old song can instantly transport someone back 20 years. Their brains aren't simply recalling information, they're reopening emotional experiences. Because the 1990s sat at the edge of two worlds, many memories from that era feel especially unique. It was a time when technology existed but hadn't yet taken over everyday life. For many people, it feels like the last chapter of one world and the first chapter of another. But not everything was perfect. The 90s generation faced a psychological pressure that few people talk about. They were expected to adapt constantly. Many learned one technology only to watch it disappear. Cassette tapes became CDs. CDs became MP3s. MP3 players became smartphones. This created resilience, but it also created fatigue. Some people who grew up during this era feel like they've spent their entire lives trying to keep up. Yet despite all these challenges, there is one psychological strength that stands out above all the rest. Flexibility. They know how to live in different worlds. They understand life before the internet and after it. They've learned that change is inevitable. And in a world that changes faster every year, that adaptability may be one of the most important psychological traits a person can have. So the next time you meet someone who grew up in the 1990s, remember this. They didn't just witness history, they lived through one of the greatest cultural and technological transitions humanity has ever experienced. One foot in the past, one foot in the future. Maybe that's exactly what makes them so unique. But what about you? Did you grow up in the 1990s? And if you did, what's one thing from that decade that you wish still existed today? Let us know in the comments. There's one more part of that world worth looking at. How people actually found information before the internet existed. If a 90s kid wanted to know something, they couldn't just type a question and get an instant answer. They had to go looking for it. If it was for school, that usually meant a library. Walking through shelves, searching a card catalog, flipping through an encyclopedia by hand to find the right entry. If a fact seemed wrong, there was no quick way to check it. Sometimes you just had to ask a teacher, a parent, or whoever seemed like they might know. If someone wanted to learn how to fix a bike, build something, or cook a new recipe, there was no video to watch. They read instructions on paper or watched someone else do it in person, then figured out the rest by trial and error. If they wanted to know what was happening in the world, they read a newspaper or waited for the evening news. Whatever the newspaper printed that morning was the information they had until the next one arrived. This process was slower, but it also forced people to build a different kind of thinking. They had to plan ahead, since they couldn't look something up mid-conversation. They had to sit with not knowing something, sometimes for days, and when they finally found the answer, it usually meant something, because they'd worked for it. Today, that entire process takes seconds. A question forms, and the answer appears before the thought is even finished. That's an extraordinary tool. But psychologists point out a trade-off. When answers arrive instantly, the brain spends less time actively searching, connecting ideas, or tolerating uncertainty. People who grew up doing it the slower way often built those muscles by accident, simply because they had no other option. And that difference, how a person learned to find answers, may shape how they think and solve problems for the rest of their life. Not better, not worse, just a completely different way of learning to think. And maybe that's the real story of the 1990s. Not the technology itself, but the years right before it, when people were quietly building skills they didn't know they'd need.